Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of the State of Affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. We've been talking a lot on the podcast over the last couple of weeks about the growing rift and divide and fight and tension and whatever else you want to call it that's been going on between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Joe Biden. Today, we have another interview with another guest to discuss the issue. This time it is with Morgan Ortagus. Morgan was the spokesperson for the State Department back during the Trump administration under Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and she now is running a think tank called Polaris US, where she's trying to push a more conservative and pro-American national security agenda. Morgan is, of course, a great communicator, talks at length about the divide right now that we're seeing between Israel and the US, but also on a more personal note, Morgan speaks about what it's like to be a Jewish convert today in the United States, raising a Jewish child amid a horrific explosion of anti-Semitism. So a very interesting interview with Morgan Ortagus. And then we're going to go to our panel. Gil Troy and Shmuel Rosner, both senior fellows at JPPI. We're going to talk about another big challenge that Israel is facing, this time from within and the ultra-Orthodox. Here we go. Morgan Ortagus, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to get your read on everything. There's a lot going on right now between Israel and the United States. That tension is very palpable right now between Jerusalem and Washington. Lots of talk over Rafah, lots of fights going on between Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Biden, his staff. How are you viewing what's happening right now between Israel and the United States?
Well, listen, it's not where I would hope that the relationship would be from a public perspective. I understand that probably from a private perspective behind the scenes, both governments are working well together. But for some reason that is totally unbeknownst to me, the Biden administration feels that public pressure is in the best interest of Israel. That's not how we did things in the Trump administration under Mike Pompeo's State Department. You know, I know that there was plenty of times that we had to have tough conversations with friends and allies. That always happened in closed doors, not openly to the media. And in fact, I think that this public pressure campaign against Israel, the administration taking to the press every time they have a grievance with Netanyahu or with Israel, actually undermines their own policy goals. Because what Hamas sees, like Hamas can read the media, Iran can read the media, and what they see is the public pressure against Israel and not the public pressure against them. Hamas is only going to come to the negotiating table when they feel like there is the threat to take them out and to defeat them militarily, right? And when they get close to that, every single time they come back to the negotiating table. So that's why it is fundamentally flawed and counterproductive to pressure Israel in public. We are, unfortunately, I believe, we're seeing the administration do this for general election electoral politics reasons, because they are trying to shift and to signal to their base. The problem is that Biden, unless he completely abandons the state of Israel, he's never going to pacify those far left activists in his party. So he's capitulating to his base in order to try and win Michigan, Minnesota, et cetera, in a way in which that, number one, I don't think is productive, because I don't think you can ever satisfy those left-wing activists. A lot of them are even being paid for these demonstrations. So number one, I don't think you can satisfy the base. And then, you know, number two, I also think that publicly pressuring Israel, again, undermines their own goals, supposedly, of getting the hostages back, which include 5 Americans. And I must say that 6 months in, to have 5 Americans still held hostage by a terrorist group is totally unconscionable. And it is a stain, a lasting stain on this administration, that they have been unable to get those 5 Americans home. Finally, I would say, this is just my opinion, no one has told me this in the administration, I think a lot of the public criticism towards Israel is politically motivated because of the general election in November. I also think it's because a lot of the Obama administration officials who are now running the Biden administration hate Bibi. They have a distaste for Bibi. They can't stand him. Most of it comes, by the way, they say it, on background to reporters all the time. And most of this stems from what happened during the JCPOA, what we called the very flawed and failed Iran nuclear deal. And so they're animus towards Bibi and his opposition of the JCPOA. I think it extends to today. They are blinded by hatred for him, enough so that they are willing to call for regime change and a democratic ally, which is obviously none of our business, right? We believe in supposedly promoting democracy around the world. So the only people who should determine who the leader of Israel is the Israeli people.
Right. But, when you ask the Israeli people, for example, in the beginning of the war, when President Biden made that historic wartime visit to Israel, sent the USS Ford, sent the USS Eisenhower, was sending all these weapon shipments, giving Israel all the support, Israelis were, I would say, in awe of this president to a large extent, who they looked at it like this grandfather, leader type figure who was giving them this comfort. And now that's changed, and you really think it's more, is it politically motivated? Like you said, it's a general election. He's got the Michigan issue with Dearborn and the large Arab Muslim population there. And we know that Donald Trump and Biden it was a close call in Michigan back in the day, so it could be again in the upcoming election. Or is it also a significant substantive policy shift in that they are not happy with the way Israel is prosecuting this war?
If it is a policy shift and based off their unhappiness, as you would say, and how Israel's prosecuting the war, that's also, in my opinion, a failed assessment. We stuck it out longer than we should have, probably for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan fighting ISIS. And by the way, we had to go back into Iraq and Syria because, as you know, AQI turned into ISIS. There was a physical caliphate. We were worried about threats to the homeland. We have the same problem, as a minor segue, right now with Afghanistan, with ISIS Khorasan having a foothold in every province, and now, of course, a major attack against Russia. So as it relates to terrorism, or even as it relates to rogue nations like Russia invading Ukraine, there is just simply not the same standard applied to Ukraine and to Zelensky as there is to Israel and Bibi Netanyahu. And that's just one example of many. We have never given the public criticisms to Zelensky that we have to Bibi Netanyahu. Further, we've never asked anybody, including ourselves, in our many, many terrorism fights, counterterrorism fights around the world, we've never asked anybody to have to completely feed and shelter the population in which embedded are terrorists who raped women, used rape as a weapon of war, burned babies, killed whole families. Again, in my opinion, if it's not political, I think there's definitely an element that is political. You can't convince me otherwise. But if it is a substantive policy difference, I just don't think that weighs on the merits. You've got, President Biden using that 30,000 Hamas Ministry of Health number that is not even accurate. You've got them literally using Hamas talking points in public speeches. So I think, and I feel comfortable, at least from the public assessments of what I've seen, that Israel is doing everything it can to get humanitarian aid in. More humanitarian aid is going in now than before October 7th, is my understanding. But I'll be quite frank, Israel must do everything it can to defeat Hamas, militarily, and that includes going into Rafah. And even if they are held to a double standard, they almost just have to ignore that double standard and ignore President Biden if they need to. This is your country's safety and security. And as much as we, the United States, would like to help, if we're preventing you from completely dismantling a terrorist organization, which, by the way, is a terrorist organization designated by the United States, by the EU, by Saudi Arabia, by other moderate nations, I say finish the job.
So, you mentioned the 30,000 number, and I have to say, if there's one thing that drives me crazy during this war, and there's a lot, but
it's the disinformation.
But it's the disinformation, but it's the way, like you said, that world leaders and the media just parrot what a terrorist organization says. And, I say to myself sometimes, if this was the Al-Qaeda health ministry or the ISIS health ministry,
Right.
Would anyone in their right mind quote them? And the answer we both know is of course not. So why is it? And you know media. I mean, you were the spokesperson for the State Department. You've worked with the media. You're on TV. You have your show. What is it about us, about Israel, about Hamas that makes this okay?
I pray and I hope this isn't true. The only thing that I can think of is that we're Jewish and that it's a Jewish state. And deep down, as much as some of these people claim that they want peace, they actually think that the Jewish people having the gall to actually formulate their own state is what in their minds, is what they think causes all of these problems throughout the Middle East. And I think ultimately, deep down, if you cornered most of these people and gave them a couple shots of schnapps and asked them what they really feel like, they feel like that the Jewish people brought this upon themselves. And so I think that's part of the problem. People are now saying the quiet part out loud. We have people openly demonstrating in the United States saying, phrases like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." We all know what that means. It is unfortunate that the Jewish people and that Israel is held to a different standard than we would for anyone else. But there's honestly no reason for Israel to be held to a different standard unless you fundamentally have a problem with the Jewish people having a state. And I think that really that's what it boils down to. They just don't think that the Jewish people should have had a state, should have created the state. And they think that their mere existence, their mere presence in Israel, in the Middle East, is what causes all of this strife. I think I actually feel for the Palestinian people. I think that they have either had to deal with Hamas, which is obviously terrible and has done nothing for them, or Abbas, who really hasn't been much better. The Palestinian Authority has been a completely failed and corrupt entity that should be defunct. We should scrap everybody in leadership and start over. I don't necessarily mean the United States. I think it is up to the Arab neighbors and to the Palestinian people to determine who their leaders are. But the Palestinian people have had no dignity under Hamas nor under Abbas. Abbas is in many ways just as bad as Hamas.
So, one of the, I think we met back when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post and you were at the State Department. We actually had you on our list of top 50 Jews back in 2020.
I remember that. It's too bad my mother-in-law wasn't alive to see that.
In the top 10. And, being part of the Jewish people, having a family that is a Jewish family and looking at the anti-Semitism that's out there today.
Yeah.
This must be a concerning time. I mean, people always said, right, that anti-Semitism is from the right. And I think there's this recognition now, okay, there might be anti-Semites on the right and we should call them out. But like you just mentioned, every person feels like they can come out and say what they used to maybe be ashamed to say. Now they say it proudly. We're seeing this explosion on the left of anti-Semitism.
Even whenever you start to bring this up, I just feel the pang in my chest. It's been so hard to talk about this since October 7th, especially being a mother to a Jewish little girl. And you start to look at what world I'm bringing her up into and what world I'm raising her in. Yaakov, I come at this from a different perspective than the majority of Jews and Israelis, because I did not grow up Jewish. I grew up Christian and I converted to Judaism. And I'm very lucky that I grew up in a home where my parents, I never heard any inappropriate jokes about the Jewish people. In fact, my parents are evangelicals, so they very much cherish Israel, cherish the Jewish people, believe they are God's chosen people. So I grew up with a deep sense of love for Israel and for the Jewish people, and converted to Judaism as an adult. So I obviously knew anti-Semitism existed. I had heard plenty of stories from, my husband and others over the years. And I think what happened on October 7th was so different for somebody like me, because I think if you were born Jewish and you were raised in it, you had family members, most likely that were in the Holocaust. You've had family members that have, maybe you've had family members that have lived in Israel, but you grew up with this sense of feeling, I am different. Every generation, there's somebody around the world that tries to annihilate us and wipe us out. I didn't grow up with that same sense. So I did have, minor things after I converted, minor things. There was a state senator here in Tennessee that said some really anti-Semitic stuff about me and Ivanka Trump to the media, which, was terrible, but that's really like, it's fine, whatever, I handled it. After October 7th, it was crushing to all of us, but also crushing to me in a way because I didn't, in so many ways I felt like people who grew up Jewish, Yaakov, were like, well, this is what happens to the Jewish
Right.
people. People try to kill us. And I felt like, well, hell no. Like, I'm not standing for this anti-Semitism. And I do think that the Jewish people writ large around the world have done a lot to fight back. But I think it was just so incredibly eye-opening for me, who became Jewish, as an adult, who converted, and I'm trying to raise my daughter. And I don't know if I'm being as eloquent as I normally am, because this is just such a personal thing. But, as a convert, it was really the first time that I realized that people, especially in Israel, people want to kill potentially me, my daughter, other Israelis, other Jews, just because of our faith.
Yeah.
Just because of who we are. We had, even here in the United States, a Persian Jewish dentist. You may have heard the story in Los Angeles that was killed just for being Jewish, right? And you obviously saw what happened on October 7th. My daughter, we were down in Florida and seeing some family there, and she was running around the playground. She goes to a religious preschool. We go to an Orthodox temple here in Nashville. And she was singing, she's learning, has this little Torah song that they sing in the preschool, Torah, 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 and she like loves to sing it. And so we're at this open, park in this like really adorable area, and she's singing it at the top of her lungs because that's what she knows. And I caught myself looking around, kind of nervous, like thinking, okay, who's here watching, listening to my daughter, who, you wouldn't necessarily know otherwise that we are Jewish, who's listening to her sing Torah at the top of her lungs. And
It's
the fact that I have to do that in America, to me, just shows how far things have devolved in a very bad way, that I'm nervous about my daughter singing a song, a preschool song about the Torah at the park.
Yeah, that's a very moving story. Morgan, I want to let you go, but one last question. You have in December, you launched your SiriusXM, the Morgan Ortagus show. I've had the opportunity to listen, but you're coming at this, you're talking about national security. Why don't you just tell our listeners what they can expect to find on the show?
Yeah, so it's every Sunday. It's a weekly radio show from 11 to 1 Eastern on SiriusXM, which is the Patriot Channel 125. You can listen live. You can listen in your car. You can listen on your phone if you're a subscriber and have the SiriusXM app. And you can also listen after the fact. You just, search my name in the app and you can find the show. We are coming up on the 4-month anniversary. It's really hard to believe. Every week we have senators on, members of Congress, former cabinet members, thought leaders. We just had Batya Ungar-Sargon on talking about her new book. And of course, we talked a lot about Israel. So the whole show is 2 hours of American national security and foreign policy, and very, very heavy emphasis, of course, on Israel and what's happening there. I was just in Israel in January and was able to interview President Herzog, which was amazing, and also the Speaker of the Knesset. And he was fantastic. He took us down to Kfar Aza, where I was able to see the kibbutz for the first time. So yeah, every Sunday, 11 to 1, SiriusXM Patriot Channel 125.
Okay. Morgan, it was great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, so Shmuel, we just heard a great interview from Morgan Ortagus. We're going to change gears, though, now and talk about a bit of what's happening internally inside Israel. It seems for now, I would say, that Prime Minister Netanyahu's government is still okay. It's, moving along. The Haredim are making all these kinds of noises, but I'm not yet seeing them really jumping or in any race to pull out and bring down the government and lead us to an early election, maybe because they fear what would happen if Netanyahu is not there and what the next government would be. But tell us, kind of just at the higher altitude perspective, what is this crisis about, and what do you think how it can be solved?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. I don't see the Haredi parties leaving the government. They have no good alternative to Netanyahu. He threw himself under a bus to try and save them, and they're not going to jump ship and abandon him at this time. I can tell you that I ran a poll just 2 days ago within the Haredi community, and you don't see such enthusiasm for abandonment among the rank and file Haredi in the Haredi street. So there will be no pressure from below on the leadership to leave the government, and the leadership doesn't see any good alternative, so they're staying in. What is the crisis about? Well, it's about 75 years in which a strange arrangement is on the books, under which Haredi youngsters are basically drafted to study in yeshiva rather than serve in the military. It's not just that they are exempt from military service. It's the state of Israel telling them, well, you have one of two choices. Either you go and serve in the IDF, or you go to yeshiva, you continue your studies, you get a stipend, and this will be your way of life. When you combine the expectations of the community with the incentives that the government, the state provides to young Haredis, you shouldn't be surprised that more than 60,000 young men are now in yeshivas rather than in battalions around or near Gaza or on the northern border. Now, all of this is known well before the war, but the war brought to the attention of Israelis the fact that the IDF needs more manpower. That, if a while ago people were speaking about a small and smart type military, this is no longer the case. Israel needs more soldiers that can be put on the border just to save lives. This is what we need. And 60,000 men could be, are
huge.
Is more than the missing link to get to where we need to be. So the pressure on the government to end this arrangement, combined with a deadline, with a legal deadline that just incidentally came at this time, brought us to the point in which there's a crisis. The Supreme Court told the government that it can no longer provide the yeshivas with the funds that they are used to get, and that basically the IDF needs to prepare itself to draft these Haredi men. The government is going to try and legislate something that will get it out of this box, but right now, public opinion and the sentiment within the Knesset is such that legislating against drafting people to military service is very complicated.
It's very complicated, and it's also, I think, raising a lot of tension within society. And Gil, there are, just over the last week, a number of rabbis who have been making very provocative statements, right? There was a couple weeks ago, Yitzchak Yosef, the chief rabbi, who said that, we should leave the country if we're forced to serve in the IDF. There was a rabbi from the very extreme Jerusalem faction, Peleg Yerushalmi, who said he'd rather have his 30 grandchildren, and great-grandchildren be killed by Arab terrorists than, God forbid, go to the army and become secular. And a comment by the head of the Porat Yosef Yeshiva in the Old City of Jerusalem, a flagship Sephardi yeshiva, also say that, who, by the way, I checked, gets over 2 million shekel annually from the state, also make very extreme comments regarding and how even those who are not learning in yeshiva, which we know to be probably the majority, that they should all still not serve. I mean, it's almost as if the country of Israel is feeding the mouths of the people who are acting against it.
Let's put two things in historic perspective. One is, there's this broader problem when indulgences become entitlements. And it's very easy to yell and scream right now about Bibi and the Likud, and I'll get to that. But first, we have to put it in some historical context and say this is a deal that went back to David Ben-Gurion's day, and every government, again and again and again, until the most recent government of Bennett Lapid, made a deal with the Haredim. And so the stench comes from the left and from the right. It comes from Yitzhak Rabin's days, and it comes from David Ben-Gurion's days, and it also obviously comes from Bibi Netanyahu's days. That's one piece. The second piece is there's a certain, we focus on the inflammatory comments, and there's a certain genuine fear. The genuine fear is the Haredim spent a lot of time trying to create their bubble, to insulate themselves from modern society, and they look at military service as a way in that will take not only the control of the rabbis away, but will actually expose their young, mostly men, to all these foreign influences that they fear. And so that's that, and it's worth thinking about that to at least respect where that's coming from. Having said that, first of all, we should point out that there are Haredim who do serve. And after October 7th, we saw a surge, not enough, of volunteering. But the fundamental issue to me is this. There is no leadership in this country. There's a leadership vacuum in this country. There are alternatives. There are compromises which could be forged. Why not have them start by doing a kind of civil guard in their communities? By the way, I think Arabs should do civil service in hospitals, and also they need police patrol. Why not take some steps? And why not have a prime minister who speaks to the people, who explains this? But instead, we have a prime minister who is missing in action and who doesn't speak to the people. And to the extent that he does, everybody thinks that he's just doing it for his own good and to keep his own coalition solid. And that's part of the problem. So you have genuine tensions. You have genuine frustrations. You also have a fascinating thing by the national religious community, which has paid an incredibly high price in this war and has buried the best of its best. We're now also seeing rabbis from that community saying, hey, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Read your Bible, read your Talmud, read halakha, Jewish law. There's nothing saying that we should serve and we're religious and you shouldn't and you're religious. So it's a very complicated thing. And the way out of it is leadership, compromise, and mutual respect. But we're stuck because we don't have any of those three.
That's what I was going to say. You took the words out of my mouth. We don't have leadership. We don't have the mutual respect. But, when I think about this whole Haredi standoff, Shmuel, and Gil kind of just touched upon this, what's fascinating and what a lot of people don't know is, people look at Israel over the last 20 years and like, oh, the Haredim and Bibi, they've always been, in a strategic alliance, but it's not true, right? I mean, you go back in time, Aryeh Deri, right? Besides for being a convicted criminal, and if you ask my opinion, abomination that he's in government and how we have somebody who's actually a convicted criminal who spent time in jail, serving in a senior position. But I put that aside. He was in the Rabin government back in the 90s that signed the Oslo Accords. I mean,
the only way for the Rabin government to pass the Oslo Accords was to quote unquote bribe the Haredi parties in order for them to vote for the agreement. Yes, this goes back.
I mean, so my point is people think it's just it's Bibi and the Haredim, Bibi and the Haredim. It's not Bibi and the Haredim. These are convenient. These are marriages of convenience to some extent.
I agree, and this was all reasonably controlled when the Haredi community was small. It's not really true. It's true that Ben-Gurion started this arrangement, but the arrangement got into real gear during the early years of Menachem Begin. He expanded the arrangement, and the numbers began rising in dramatic way after Menachem Begin.
Yeah.
But the Haredi community was still relatively small, and you could say, okay, we can deal with that. We can contain a small, fragile community, a minority community. They have their own way of life. So we'll have 3% or 5% of Israelis who do not serve. The issue is that the Haredi community is growing very fast. It is no longer a 3% or 5% community. It's close to a 15% community. And the trajectory that we see, all the projections for the future demography of Israel is that the Haredi community keeps growing to 20% and 25% and 30% and 33%. And one must ask himself, well, what are we going to do with soldiers when the Haredi community will be 33% of a third of the population? And you have Arabs that are also 20% of the population, which means that your pool of resources begins at 50% or 48%. It makes no sense. You cannot continue this facade of a people's army, which the IDF is supposed to be, when a growing sector does not serve. Now, I agree with Gil. We should address the issue of Arab Israelis as well. This is not just about the Haredi community. It's also about the Arabs. But as I said at the beginning of my remarks, the issue with the Haredim is not just the fact that they are exempt from service. They are incentivized not to serve by the state of Israel, which makes no sense at all. The minimum thing that Israel must do is say, well, okay, you don't serve, but you don't get money for it. We don't force you into yeshivas and pay you to stay
we
there.
pay you not to serve. That's the irony.
We pay not to serve and not to study and not to work. This is what we pay for. We pay these people for them to stay in yeshiva until they're 26 years old, when it's too late for them, or almost too late for them, to go and study university, to begin useful and fruitful careers, or to do anything else. So this whole arrangement is really, from the viewpoint of the state of Israel, it makes no sense. And it needs to end that the political pressure is hard to overcome.
Well, especially when they hold the keys to the coalition and they could bring down the government, and then Netanyahu finds himself in an election, which he might not win. But you know what I was thinking about, Gil, and as a historian, I wonder how you look at this, is that it's kind of one of these issues that I think there's a bunch of them that we as a country just haven't dealt with over the years, right? It's like, I don't like the word festered, but it's kind of like we said, you know what, yeah, it's an issue, but we're not going to deal with it. And there's the Haredim, and there's the integration of Israeli Arabs, and there's the Palestinians. And now we're seeing post-October 7th, what happens when you think you just build up a big wall and you keep the Hamas terrorists on the other side of it. I mean, there's not having a constitution, which is a big issue that JPPI is working on. And it's like, it's almost as if we're seeing play out before our eyes how you can't, as a country, just turn a blind eye to something. You have to, we need, and you kind of touched upon this. So, but we need leadership. We need to deal with these issues.
It's leadership. It's also, sometimes culture, the very culture that makes you successful also makes you unsuccessful. So there's a Hebrew phrase, patent, right? A patent is when you kind of improvise something, improvise an end around. And that culture of the patent has been essential in Startup Nation, because there you have to kind of improvise and figure out a problem and solve it temporarily, and then you move on in business. But in politics, when you do that again and again and again, and you add two other things, one, this leadership vacuum, and two, tribal clashes, you're creating a massive problem. And the hope was that we've already paid the huge price of October 7th. What lessons can we learn? So we keep on coming back to the need to respect one another and work together and change the tone in politics. But that, as you're suggesting, isn't enough. We have to learn how to not just kick the can down the pike again and again and again. We have to learn how to start looking at some of the fundamental questions in Israeli society and start dealing with them, start solving them, rather than simply waiting for the next coalition to solve it. Now, we should pull back the camera and see that the United States of America is also in a moment where partially because of a harsh partisanship, it's very hard to get anything done. They can, barely just, where good governance is in very short supply, but that's not an excuse. And that's not a justification. And especially given the high price we've already paid, it's time to move forward. The other thing I want to say is that it's really shocking to me to see how poorly the Haredim are reading the room. People have loved to say, oh, the Haredim are so anti-democratic. And I love to have in my PowerPoint presentation, sometimes I show a picture of 600,000 Haredim demonstrating down with the draft night. And I go, oh, how undemocratic. And everybody goes, oh, how undemocratic. And then I show a picture of 100,000 of Tel Avivim. And I say, oh, that's democratic. They're exercising their democratic right. The Haredim as a whole, and we should be careful not to overly demonize. I hate the words, but Haredi political parties have done a brilliant job of using democracy and teaching us one or two things about democracy. Now I'm watching the older Haredi rabbis not read the room. They're missing the fact that things have changed. But as Shmuel said, the army's needs have changed. And as you said, the people's expectations have changed. And they're going to pay a very high price. I think they're playing a very short-term game, and they're going to pay very long-term, a very long-term and very high price for their short-sightedness.
So before I let you both go, give us your predictions a week ahead. How does this play out? I know no one likes to be a prophet, but where are we going with this? Does it get solved? And how does this come to a resolution, if at all? Shmuel?
It'll take time. This is not something that will happen in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. The shortage of manpower will not be filled in the next couple weeks of month. The Haredi community is going to pull back. It's going to shield itself against the winds of change. For this to ignite a process that will ultimately lead to a significant alteration of the current social arrangement, we need to have patience. We need to take some steps, use carrots and sticks and all those things that economists like to talk about, and then wait for 3 years, for 5 years, for 10 years, wait for this process to take root and to begin to peel away more layers of Haredi society and lure them into a more integrative way of conducting their business. No one wants them to become secular. We are not trying to secularize them, but we do need, as a country, again, I respect the Haredi way of life. I disagree with it. And I need to remember that the majority, they are the minority. We need to protect minority rights, but we also have to protect majority rights and interests. And the interest of the majority in this country is to make sure the Haredis contribute to Israel's economy and that they contribute to Israel's security and that cannot benefit from all of the advantages that Israel provide without them taking their part in, like all other citizens, in rowing this ship into a safe harbor.
So it takes time. Gil, your prediction as much as possible?
Well, you made it easy by saying a week, because Bibi Netanyahu is the great procrastinator, and he kicks cans down the pike even when he's at his best. So I think that within a week we'll still be stuck. But listening to Shmuel, I was actually thinking that this is actually an interesting opportunity. We love to talk about the failure of leadership on the part of the majority. Are Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid and others reaching out to the Haredim and saying, look, guys, read the polls, read the room. You may have power today, but it's probably going to disappear tomorrow. You can continue to kind of play this game of chicken. You continue to play this game of blackmail with the state, but our side of the team, our side of the population is finished with this. And maybe we can have opposition leaders speaking back channels to Haredi leaders, especially I would say a younger generation of rabbis, trying to find some compromise. So rather than just being the party of no, and the opposition always saying no, 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 and Yair Lapid always yelling and screaming about how the sky is falling, maybe he can show some of his centrist skills that he boasted about when he was prime minister for 12 seconds and start trying to come out with some kind of compromise, indeed, for 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now. And all of a sudden, we start looking at Israeli society not as a zero-sum game, but as a win-win for all. And I think that's what we're trying to get from our soldiers who know how to do that and broaden it from society. So why not use this as an opportunity for growth rather than another opportunity for tribal bashing?
Which, by the way, I mean, you
It's not a
mentioned
prediction. It's a challenge.
you mentioned Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, and, you know, with all due respect to the two of them, neither has really rolled out a vision or plan, except just to say we need equality, and, you know, but not how they would do it or how they would actually move forward. I have a feeling that this is going to be an issue that is going to accompany us for some time, and we're going to continue to talk about it because, hey, if we haven't solved it in almost 76 years, we're not going to solve it on today's podcast. So I want to thank Shmuel Rosner.
Wouldn't it be great?
Shmuel Rosner, Gil Troy, and Morgan Ortagus, who joined us earlier. Thanks to all our listeners and viewers. You can catch us again on Thursday for another episode of the JPPI Inside Analysis. In the meantime, have a great